Daniel today. And I know a lot of us do know, probably just, from Bible storybooks and Sunday school, we have a fair idea of, I think, more of the things that happened in Daniel's life more than Daniel himself. So what happened for myself, and the reason I chose this character, is that currently with my daughters, we choose a book to read, and then we'll read that whole Bible book in pieces, but we don't jump around through the books, because for them it becomes more of a story and they can look forward to what's going to happen and see how that evolves. So we chose Daniel, and so we've been reading it, and then because I'm helping Lexi to read it, I basically read everything twice because I'm reading with her as well. So it's nice because things really then stick in your head. And I found it interesting reading through it, just how I haven't really ever looked at Daniel as a person. And I also have realized that depending on where you are in your life and what your experiences have been, often different parts of the Bible or different verses, will be highlighted for you. You can read the same piece, but different pieces jump out at you depending on, where in your life you are. So, but I've been going through quite a time of change just in my work situation, and so I think that's been quite foremost in my mind. And reading through Daniel, I can draw a lot of encouragement from him, and I can see a lot of where it's relevant to our lives as employees. First of all, is because we are often working for sometimes bosses who are not really God-driven. And so, Daniel was working for kings who were not God-driven. And so the way that he lived his life there has really spoken to me. So this is not a very in-depth study, but I'm just going to be highlighting some of the points of interest that stood out to me, and kind of sharing how I drew encouragement from that. And I'm happy for anyone else to chip in and share from their side as well. So the first thing I'm going to look at is Daniel was captured, but he was not conquered. And that's, you can look at just when we very first introduced to Daniel, in Daniel 1, we know that the king asked for children. The word that he uses for children is actually a word used for very young people. And so he wanted children from the people that they had now taken out of Israel, and he had specific requirements, and he wanted them to be trained to be able to work in his palace. And Daniel was one of those chosen, and he was of noble heritage. And now, putting yourself in Daniel's shoes, being very young, being in a strange country with people who clearly, are not your best friend, it doesn't seem right or like in your best interests to stand up against them even further or not to be difficult. But Daniel stayed faithful to his principles, especially about his religious rules. And we know the story about how he refused to eat the king's food, and he asked the chief of the eunuchs to rather give them vegetables and water. And when he didn't want to, Daniel persuaded him, just give it to us for 10 days, and then you can test and see who looks better after the 10 days. And after the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends who had chosen to do this with him, they looked better than the other young men. So they could then continue doing this. Not really in return, but I think because Daniel stayed true to God, God also stays true to Daniel. And the Bible tells us that God gave them favor with the chief of the eunuchs. He says that he made the chief of the eunuchs look on Daniel with tender love. So he really cared about him and his well-being. And then it also tells us that God gave them knowledge and skill. These 4, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave them knowledge and skill, And when the king tested them, he found them 10 times better than all of the magicians and astrologers in his kingdom. And that is in Daniel 1 verse 20. So I do think this is a pretty straightforward lesson, but maybe not so easy to apply, is to just know, that if you stay true to God, God will always stay true to you, but you kind of need to be acting in faith and sometimes take a stand so that people know that this is what you stand for. And as I said, I'm happy for people to chip in, or we can wait until afterward and you can share with me maybe if there's something that stood out for you and where you've seen this happen in your life as well. The next point of interest that I picked up with Daniel is that he's a role model and an advocate. So with this diet situation, it never mentions that the 4 friends chose to stick to their principles. It says that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not eat the king's food, and that he went to the eunuch and he explained it. So the friends also chose to then eat that diet, but they didn't stand up for themselves. So he sets a good example for them, and they did choose to follow it, which was great. But I do wonder then, did this situation and the experience they had possibly encourage them when the 3 of them on their own were faced with having to choose whether they would bow down before the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had made, or whether they would not, and they would stand up for their principles. And I'd like to think that the way that they had seen God work in their favor when they chose to stick true and stay faithful, I'd like to think that that was encouraging to them, and that helped them then also be able to stand up for themselves and say, no, we're also going to stand up for our beliefs. And then there's just a little verse, and this is actually the verse that got me started. After Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he gets promoted, and this is in Daniel 2, right at the end in verse 48. It says, then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all his wise men. And then verse 49 says, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be in charge of all the affairs of the province of Babylon, while Daniel remained in the king's court. And so the reason that this verse kind of resonated with me is that one of the issues that I've been working through at work is needing to appoint someone to help, and having taken on just way too much. And because you put it, you get given more. And then you put it that, and then you get given more. And never do you finally, you just kind of think that you have to do it all. And so when I read that, I'm like, you know what? If even Daniel delegated to his 3 friends, then maybe it's okay if I also make a point of delegating and appointing someone else, to another role. And so that's kind of why it stuck with me. And then I thought, let me see what else Daniel can teach me. So that's a good lesson just for us, in general. But the greater impact of this is that Daniel, I feel, was not just feeling like, okay, I can't do everything. I think he was weighing up where can I have most influence and be the voice of my people? Because being the governor of Babylon was good, and it was an important role, but it's very much, when you read through what they had to do, it's a very administrative role. Whereas being in the king's court, or other Bible translations say he sat in the gate of the king. So if you go and look at what that means, sitting in the gate means being counselor to the king, and also often being involved in settling disputes, so acting as a judge. And in that role, you can see how Daniel could be a voice for the Jews, because there were now many Jews living in that city, and he would have influence with the king. But if he was off, counting how many of this and how many of that and how many taxes are being paid, he would not have had time to have that role. And so I think that's another lesson for us, is to really look at what are our priorities and where are we going to be able to be of best use, instead of just doing everything. Then the next point that I noticed is that Daniel gives us this example of being in the world but not of the world. And what I noticed is that in many of the instances where the different kings, because we have various kings that Daniel served, they have this dream or this writing on the wall, and they get in a fluster and they call all the wise men and all the astrologers and all these people, the magicians, and they want to know the answer. And every time this happens, Daniel is not there. They have to go afterwards and go call Daniel, or Daniel finds out about this later. And so they go fetch him once all of these people have failed to obviously help the king. And I don't actually have an answer, but I was wondering, why was Daniel, he was chief of all the wise men. He was trained to be one of the wise men of Babylon. So why is it that he isn't there, with this group? And some of the things that I reflected on, and that seemed the most fitting to me, is the idea of, yes, he was part of this group, but he was not with them all of the time. And, for me personally, that could also, I can relate to that, because yes, I have certain colleagues and we work together, but outside of that context, I don't necessarily agree with, what they believe, or the way that they spend their free time, or the sexuality that they choose to be. So I don't have to be their best friend and go visit with them in their homes and be found with them all of the time. You can do your job together without kind of having to be with them all the time. So I do think Daniel, with his very strong religious convictions, and that would have been very different, most likely did make that decision to not, live in the same spaces where they were living, not, fraternize with them any more than what's necessary. And quite possibly he just maybe had more important things to do. And yet, even though he chose to do that, again, that almost counts in his favor, because then every time they all fail, he gets called in and then he is able to succeed, which then just highlights that difference in what they were able to do and what he was able to do through God. I'm not sure if I mentioned that specifically, but it is amazing how every time he is very humble. He will give the credit to God. He doesn't want all the gifts and the rewards. So that's sort of just an aside as well. I might mention it later again, we'll see. And then I also noticed how he uses the scriptures and the prophets as a life guide. So you'll see in Daniel 9 verse 2, I'll read that for us quickly. So in Daniel 9 verse 2, it says, "During the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, learned from reading the word of the Lord, as revealed to Jeremiah the prophet, that Jerusalem must lie desolate for 70 years. So I turned to the Lord God and pleaded with him in prayer and fasting." So he knew what Jeremiah had said, and being a wise man and having the skills and the knowledge, he knew that now was close to the end of these 70 years, and now is the time to start petitioning God and asking him, to start intervening in the situation and allowing them to return to Jerusalem. And I believe the reason that he didn't do that earlier, because for the rest of his time in Babylon, he was quite invested in the king's well-being and in Babylon's well-being. He worked for the king. He worked in the best interests of that country and that city. And why did he do that? And I think the answer is that he says here that he was reading Jeremiah the prophet. And in Jeremiah 29, verse 4 to 7, I'll see if I can find quickly. Here we go. Okay, so Jeremiah, verse 4 to 7, it's a letter that Jeremiah sent to the exiles in Babylon. It says, "This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to all the captives he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Then find spouses for them so that you may have many grandchildren. Multiply, do not dwindle away. And work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for its welfare will determine your welfare." So Daniel, knowing the scriptures, had a very good guide. He knew that he was acting in the purpose of God's plan, in investing his strength and his energy in the well-being of that city. And again, I think the lessons for us are quite clear. If you know, or it's almost a call to, get to know God's plan better. It almost seems a bit easy here because the prophecy is so short-term, but, we need to now get to know the prophecies that relate to us and our future so that we know when do we stay and thrive and focus on, now and preaching, and when do we earnestly start praying that God needs to start intervening. And I think some of the previous classes we've had in our Bible classes have been quite enlightening as to what we should be looking out for regarding these prophecies. And then Daniel had long-term influence. So we know through knowing the examples of the incidents that happened in Daniel's life, the interpretations of the dreams, being thrown into the lion's den, his friends refusing to bow down to the statue. After every one of these events, the king of that time would have sort of this new revelation about how incredible the God of the Israelites is. And when they had this revelation, they would then write it out, and it would be sent out into the provinces, and everyone would be told about how powerful this God is, and he's the God that's in charge of everything. And even unfortunately, they seem to forget that quite quickly. I've often, when I read, things like Ezra and Nehemiah, I think, like, why was this king happy to suddenly send all of these Israelites back, to give them money, to give them protection, to allow them to build this temple? What? It seems quite strange that, someone who conquered this nation is now wanting to see them thrive. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that Daniel's influence with the kings throughout this time, just his quiet, sort of steadfast, always being there, always proving the power of God, would have helped to create, favor with the kings and to sort of set the tone for this to happen. So I don't have any evidence for that, but that's just something that I'm reflecting on. And then I found a verse in Ezekiel 14, also relating to Daniel, and I'd never read this before. So it says, it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and God says through Ezekiel, he says, "Though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they should deliver but their own souls by their righteousness, saith the Lord God. And in Ezekiel 14 verse 20, just a few verses on it, it says this exact same thing. These three men, they'll only save themselves because of their righteousness. And so I found it interesting. Okay, so why Noah, Daniel, and Job? Why these three specific characters? And so then what I did is I went to see, okay, what do we know about Noah? What do we know about Job? What do we know about Daniel? What do they have in common? And this is what I found. So in Genesis 6 verse 9, this is how Noah is described. It says, Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Then in Job 1 verse 1, we have Job described. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And then we have Daniel described when the wise men or the governors are trying to find a reason to get him killed. It says that they could find no occasion nor fault. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. And when I went to look at this with fault here with Daniel, that word fault is specifically related to corruption. So there was no corruption. He did everything justly. And isn't it amazing that we have these three exact characteristics of being just? Noah was just, Job was upright, there's no fault, no corruption with Daniel. They are perfect. There's not any error with Daniel. Job's perfect, Noah's perfect, and they're all faithful. So Noah walked with God, Job feared God, and Daniel was faithful. I found that almost scarily simple, but very, very amazing. And it also brought to mind another verse, and this is actually going to be my closing thoughts, is, okay, so now what is this for us? I always like to take what I learn and apply it as quickly as possible, kind of so that it actually makes a difference. So the verse that these three words brought to mind was Micah 6 verse 8. He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. And so I just love how the Bible just repeats the same thing again and again and again. And what it's asking you to do is not very complex, but I think it is quite challenging. But I do think that we should all be up for the challenge. So those are the points of interest that I've taken from our readings of Daniel in the last couple of weeks.